Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the 2018 Candidates Tournament. We're in round 7. We're not quite halfway through. There's 14 rounds in this tournament. Winner does go on to play Magnus Carlsen in the World Championship in November. Our competitors today, White's going to be played by Sergey Karjakin. He won this tournament 2 years ago, went on to lose to Magnus Carlsen in a tiebreaker at the end. So he is no stranger to winning this thing. His opponent, Wesley, playing the black pieces. Wesley had one of the best years last year, trying to really take that momentum into this year and come out with a victory. Unfortunately for both these players, they are both tied for last place coming into the round. They are 2 points behind the leader, Fabiano Caruana, but lucky for them, they do have 8 rounds left, so plenty of time. Both of them still play Fabiano in the tournament, so they have plenty of time to make up that ground. But one of these players will be looking to inch up their way to the leaderboard, and the other person will have a tough time coming back from that. So we'll go ahead and get started with Karjakin. Starts out pawn to d4, a knight f6, pawn c4, pawn e6, and then knight to c3, getting into the Nimzo Indian defense. Not something we actually see too often. Most players will opt for, instead of knight to c3, knight to f3, just to avoid the lines, because black has such a good attack against the Nimzo Indian defense. But Sergey Karjakin, not too worried about it, plays knight to c3. The bishop comes down here to b4, and we see the main continuation. That is pawn to e3. Then castle on the king side, knight to f3, pawn d5. This is the main line, and then pawn or bishop here to d2. This is where things do change. More common would be bishop to d3, pawn down here to c5, but this is not what we see. Instead, bishop here to d2, pawn down to c5, and then pawn to a3. And this may look fairly common, but it's not. We usually do see this bishop at some point coming here to d3. Could even come to e2 if we really wanted to, but getting ready to castle on the king side. But we see that pawn to a3. And there's a few different options as far as how black could continue. We have fairly common, bishop takes here on c3. Bishop's going to recapture so that there's not that double pawn on the c file. So after the bishop takes, we see the pawn take here on d4. Couple different ways that both sides could exchange from here. Knight to c3 development, pawn takes, pawn recaptures, and this is going to be fine. Now the light square bishop, if he wants to get involved, castle on the king side. That is one option. Now, another option would be to come back to a5. A lot of players would make the mistake in playing this. Unfortunately, this is a pretty bad move, because after the pawn takes on c5, white is up a pawn in material, and if you say, well, let's go ahead and attack that pawn, queen to e7, probably the most likely scenario. Then pawn to b4, and you can see this attacks the bishop and also defends this pawn right here. It's going to be very, very tough for black to hold on to this. Now we can see even knight to b5 really start to attack black. So white's up a material and does have a strong attack. But we see another interesting move from black here. Not quite as strong as just the bishop takes here on c3, but we see instead the pawn taking here on d4. And then we see some exchange. Pawn takes here on b4, so there is the pawns, the double pawns on the b file. After the bishop takes, the pawn takes, the bishop takes up here on c3. Queen takes, king recaptures. It doesn't really matter if the rook takes or the king takes. Once the queens are off the board, not as important that one of the sides castles, because their king is fairly safe with the queen off the board. This does allow for this rook to control the semi-open file on a1, and then to move this king here to e2 or c2, more than likely e2, so that it's protected behind this pawn. Swing over this rook here to d1, control this open file on the d file. Bishop to d7, king up here to e2, rook to c8, and then bishop back here to d3. So you can see what both sides have done in the exchange. Not a very common line we see in the Nimzo Indian defense, but white has the bishop pair. It's a completely open board state, so that's exactly what Sergey is looking to do, is have that advantage. He also has much more active pieces. The rook here on a8, it's going to take a while for that piece to ever get activated. The knight here on b8 can easily get activated, but right now it hasn't moved so far. White does have both these bishops in the center of the board, can easily activate both these rooks, control these long open files. But if we look from Black's point of view, he does have these 2 pawns here. These, kind of act as 1.5 pawns if you're looking at it from material, but from just a development standpoint is behind. So we would really like with these 2 knights, if we have these minor pieces getting into the end game, to have everything taking place on one side of the board. If you look at minor pieces, their strengths and weaknesses, knights do very well controlling one side of the board because they can just control every single square, where bishops can control the entire board, so they'd rather have pawn structures on both sides of the board. So that's what both sides are going to be looking at as we continue on this board state. So plays knight to d5, attacking the bishop here on c3, trying to get rid of the bishop pair. It's also attacking the pawn here on b4, and there's no great way for Karjakin to hold on to this material. He could definitely bring his bishop back, d2 or e1. E1 looks worse because it's blocking any sort of development from this rook here on h1. But if it came back here to d2, okay, well, knight to c6, simple development move from Wesley. So attacking the pawn. There are now both of these knights attacking this. If for some reason pawn to b5, and all of a sudden knight to b4, attacking this bishop. Now the rook can get involved into the game. And this bishop here on d7 is also attacking this pawn here on b5. So White's going to lose the material he's trying to hold on to. And at the end of the day, he's losing a lot of the initiative he has. So Sergey Karjakin decides, let's not worry about that right now. Instead, let's play knight to e5. Offering up and says, hey, if you want to go and take my bishop here on c3, I'm willing to do that. I like the exchange that happens here. Wesley so took 30 minutes for the next 2 moves because he recognized that there's a very long line, and he has to calculate very precisely to make sure that he goes down the path he wants to. And he decides with bishop to e8. But the line that he was looking at, and talked about this after the match, was knight taking here on c3. And then after pawn takes here on c3, rook takes, rook here to c1. After the rook takes, rook over here to c1. And both sides are, fairly even. White is down a pawn in material, but able to get to that back here. But in exchange, Black's in a tough spot right here. How does Black really respond from here? He really needs to play something like pawn to f6 because this bishop right here on d7, because after the pawn to f6, for those curious, knight takes, and then a rook up here to c7. Going to get back material on the board, and then he has the bishop. That's going to be better for White. But if instead the pawn doesn't come to f7, the reason the pawn has to come here is because of the threat of the rook coming up to either the 7th rank or the 8th rank, depending on where this bishop is. If the bishop were to come to e8, then all of a sudden rook to c8, maybe king to f8, bishop here to b5. This bishop is being pinned down. This is going to go extremely bad. If we see something else on the board, there's just not a lot of great options. Instead, maybe bishop here to c6. Okay, well now just pawn to b5. This is kind of forcing the action. The bishop is going to fall, or the rook's going to come up here. So at the end of the day, recognizing really the best option would be pawn here to f6. Didn't really like how that exchange ended up. He decided at the end of the day that after knight to e5, he did not want to go ahead and take here on c3. First playing bishop to e8. But this is a fairly defensive move from Wesley, so very active piece here, a knight on e5. Now the bishop comes back here to d2. It is a very different situation than as we saw before. Pawn here to f6, forcing the knight to come back, knight back to c4. Rook over here to d8, and then rook to c1. So both sides continuing with their plan. White trying to control these open files with the rooks. Still has these double pawns here on the b file. Black does need to get more material involved into the game. Has not activated his other knight. Does need to counterattack with his other rook as well. Now, white did have a different option. He could have played pawn to e4 instead, forcing the knight to come back. Maybe now knight to a5, preparing for knight to b7. Doesn't really matter if the pawn moves or not. Still be a great square for the knight to come up to b7. Just putting a lot of pressure on this back rank for black. But instead decided for the more natural rook over here to c1, controlling this open file. Knight down to c6, bishop to e4, controlling these light squares. This pawn is undefended right now, so attacking both the knights. If the knights decide to move, it does attack this pawn here on b7. Knight takes on b4, bishop takes, knight takes, and then the bishop takes here on b7. So at the end of the day, we see both sides equal in minor pieces as well as regular pieces as well. And so I think both sides can be fairly happy with this. It gives Wesley So the opportunity to not have to worry about that bishop pair, but white no longer has to worry about his double pawns on the b file. So now it's going to come down to who can execute the best in the endgame. We see black play rook to b8. Rook takes up here on a7. Rook to d7. Knight up here to a5, protecting the bishop. Now knight down here to d3, attacking both the pawn and the rook, trying to get back that material on the board. Rook over here to d1, and then the rook to b2, rook check. Rook takes here, bishop takes, and then bishop here to c6. So both sides have done a good job of trading down material and equalizing, getting those pawns off the queen side of the board. Said, let's just worry about what we have going on the king side of the board. After the bishop takes, the knight takes here on c6, so it's a fairly even endgame, but you can probably see that white has a clear advantage because he has a much more aggressive position on the board. His rook is up here on the 7th rank. That's exactly where you want your rook. If you're white, if you're black, you want it down here on the 2nd rank. Just attack so much of your opponent's material. You can get behind enemy lines, start to attack some of these pawns that probably haven't moved very much. And this knight here on c6 is a very, very dangerous piece for black to have to deal with. It cuts off some of these great squares that the rook would like to be at, as well as some of the squares that the king would like to go to. It can't come to e7 or d8, so it has limited options as far as how it can continue. So white's going to be looking to move his king up the board, or can also just start to attack on the king side of the board. Black's going to be looking to activate both of his knight and rook together and start to have some sort of attack or just trade off, end up with an endgame that he can easily draw into, come out of here with a nice safe half a point going into round number 8. Black rook is under attack, so swings it back over here to e8. Pawn e4, knight c4, trying to get the knight involved into the action. King here to d3, attacking the knight. Knight to d6, attacking the pawn. Pawn to f4, since pawn is being protected by the king. King here to f8. Wesley So just trying to get that king involved into the action. Pawn to e5. We do see an exchange attacking the knight. Knight to f5. Pawn up here to g4, so pushing on the king side of the board. Knight to h4, and then, hey, let's continue to push that king. King here to c4, knight to f3, attacking both the pawn here on e5 as well as the pawn on h2. Very easy for white just to play pawn to h3. It's out of harm's way. This knight here on c6 does a good job of protecting this pawn on e5. Not really sure, but white decided to play rook down here to a2. Does protect it. Just don't think he had to do it in the game. Rook here to c8, king up here to b5, and this is where things get pretty unfortunate for Wesley. So he really needed to play something like rook to c7. This allows his rook to come to d7 if it wants to, f7 if it wants to, but in the game he played king to e8. That's unfortunate because king here to b6, getting ready to push forward with king to b7, attacking the rook. There's no great place for this rook to go to. All of the squares I've marked are not only the only options for the rook to go to, but those are all defended by white pieces. So no great squares. If black were to decide, okay, well, I'll just move my king. Well, king here to f8. Well, that's going to be met by rook to f2, pinning down the knight. The knight's going to fall. Well, that's a pretty terrible option. We can't come here to e7 because we look at the knight here. Let's say king here to d7. Well, rook up here to a7 check after the king moves. Doesn't really matter where it comes to. Then all of a sudden, rook comes over here, takes here on g7, can gobble up more material. Black also has to worry about the rook coming up here to g8 check and getting this rook here on c8. So no great option on the board. Wesley So definitely recognized it afterwards. Decided to go ahead and play pawn down here to g5 and then pawn to h3. So not in a huge rush right now. Doesn't have to worry about, he still has the attack if he wants to ever play this king up here to b7. Just waiting to see what his opponent does. And Wesley So decides, okay, I have no good options, so I'm just going to give up my knight. I'm going to take a pawn. I'm going to give up my knight. He's going to recapture, but at least it allows me to get my rook and save that bad boy. So the knight takes here on e5. Rook comes down here to c3, attacking the pawn. Rook comes over here to h2. It's not very aggressive from Sergey, but it is protecting the pawn. And, white knows that he's up a ton of material now after he's taken his opponent's knight. So king here to e7, king down to b5, and then after rook to e3, Wesley So decided to resign in this position, even though he made the move. He only had a couple minutes left on the clock and just didn't feel like he had the capability to come back and even draw this game. Wish he would have continued, but recognizing that only had a couple minutes makes a lot of sense why he would just resign this position. Not the tournament that he was hoping for, but congratulations to Sergey Karjakin. He climbs a few ranks in the ladder. Fabiano Caruana won, so he's still 2 points behind the leader, but hopefully this gives Karjakin some momentum going into the last 8 rounds of the tournament, and hopefully he can continue his run as he did 2 years ago. So hopefully you guys enjoying round 7, and we will be back in the next round. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.